Latest consumer price index came out Friday morning showing inflation is growing again. The report showed that the average American consumer paid 8.6% more last month for a basket of goods and services than he or she would have paid a year earlier. President Biden's top economic advisor admitted Friday that that was uncomfortably high. So what should we think about the state of the U.S. economy and what to do about it? I wanted to ask former Fed Chair Ben Bernanke for his perspective. He's the author of a new book, 21st Century Monetary Policy. Ben Bernanke, welcome. Thanks for being on the show.
Good to be here.
So when you look at the polls, something like 75% of Americans in most surveys think the economy is seriously in bad shape or on the wrong track, or depending on how you describe it. Do you think that's right? How would you characterize the American economy these days?
Well, to put that number in context, they've been asking that question for decades, and people always say that the economy and the country are heading in the wrong direction, but they themselves are doing okay. So you have to put a little bit of context around that. But that being said, the U.S. economy today is a mixed bag. We've had a lot of growth. We had a deep recession, but last year the economy grew between 5 and 6%, created 6 million jobs. The labor market is very hot. Wage increases are going to particularly the lowest paid workers. So all that is positive. But on the other hand, we also have inflation that we haven't seen for 40 years. And that, particularly anyone who goes to the gas station or the grocery store is quite aware of that. And that is cutting into people's living standards, and even people getting wage increases are not seeing real increases in their ability to consume. So it is a very much a mixed bag at this point.
And the big debate raging in Washington these days is, what is it going to look like 6 months from now or 7 months from now as the Fed tries to tackle inflation? And as you know, Larry Summers, former Treasury Secretary, says the Fed is going to have to act much more aggressively than it's acting now. Effectively, I think what he's saying is it is going to have to induce a recession in order to bring inflation under control. In other words, it's going to have to slow down economic activity by raising rates so people's mortgages go up, so it costs more to borrow money, therefore they'll spend less. You got to do all that, which will put the economy into a recession in order to tackle inflation. Do you agree with Larry Summers?
No, I don't. I think a recession is possible. Economists are very bad at predicting recessions. But I think the Fed has a decent chance, a reasonable chance of achieving what Jay Powell calls a softish landing, either no recession or a very mild recession to bring inflation down.
When you look at the economy going forward, does it look like the stagflation of the 1970s? And does it feel like, at that period, it felt like people were out of economic tools to solve the problems? Do you feel like we're in a situation like that today?
No, I don't. And I could go on forever. My book covers the 70s in some detail and points out a lot of differences between then and now. Though a very basic difference is that the inflation of the 70s lasted for 13 or 14 years, not 6 months. So people became very, very used to inflation, and a huge inflation psychology developed. And that was very, very difficult for Paul Volcker, the chair of the Fed in the early 80s, to break that inflation psychology. That's why he had to bring down the hammer as hard as he did in the early 80s. So I think it's a very different situation. I think today we have a Federal Reserve that knows that it's responsible for inflation. It's going to take the lead. It's got a lot of credibility. We've had low inflation now for 40 years. It's got political support. The president just came out recently saying the Fed is independent and he would support Jay Powell's decisions. The Congress has also been supporting the Fed. So I think it's just a very different situation.
Fair to say, Ben Bernanke, you're saying the economy is not as bad as it looks. The Fed has things under control. Don't worry.
Well, no, some things could go wrong. I'm counting on the supply side to look better. I'm counting on the supply chains to begin to improve. And there's some evidence that they are. I'm hoping and guessing that oil prices and food prices will at least stabilize and preferably begin to moderate. Things could go bad if all those things don't work out and people start losing confidence in the Fed. then the Fed might have to crack down much harder. So the Larry Summers scenario you described earlier is certainly a possibility if inflation persists and people lose confidence in the Federal Reserve and inflation psychology develops and you get a wage price spiral, all those things we saw in the 70s. And that's why it was so painful for Paul Volcker to end inflation in the early 80s. So I'm not being a Pollyanna here, but I'm saying it's not necessarily going to be a catastrophic situation either, because again, if we get some help from supply side, we have an underlying pretty strong economy. People, labor market is just roaring right now. People have pretty good savings. All those things suggest that with some luck, and if the supply side improves, that the Fed can get inflation down without imposing the kind of costs that we saw in the early 80s.
Ben Bernanke, always a pleasure. Your book is 21st Century Monetary Policy, the Federal Reserve from the Great Inflation to COVID-19. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Fareed.